So here's the deal. I just turned 18 a little over a week ago. On my birthday, instead of throwing a party like most parents might do, mine sat me down and dropped a bombshell. I needed to start paying rent if I wanted to keep living under their roof. I was caught off guard because this topic had never come up before. My relationship with my parents has always been distant. We never really talked, and they were never the affectionate type. Growing up, everything I needed was provided for, but there was always this sense that it was out of obligation rather than genuine care. Nowadays, I wouldn't say we have the closest bond. My mom teaches high school English, and my dad works in marketing, so money isn't exactly tight for them. But I've always felt like they weren't thrilled about spending money on me. It was more about fulfilling a duty than wanting to provide things I actually wanted. Just to be on the safe side, I decided to get a job in high school. It was just the job of an intern at the nearby office supply store, but it paid decently and I could manage it alongside school. So I had no complaints, and I had even saved up some money for myself. I wouldn't say that I had enough to move out, but I could at least cover rent for the first couple of months if I stayed somewhere extremely cheap or split it with roommates. I didn't know about the other costs, though. These were measures that I'd only taken for the worst-case scenario, but I didn't really think that I would actually have to end up utilizing this money so soon. On my birthday, when my parents told me that I could either start paying rent or move out of their house, I decided to move out. It was insulting enough that they had just been waiting for me to be a legal adult, so they could kick me out. I didn't need to be reminded of that by staying in that house. So, in a fit of anger, I decided to pack my stuff and go to a friend's house for the night. My parents didn't even try to stop me, so I left and haven't gone back since. It came out of nowhere because even though my parents had always been very less inclined to spend money on me, they'd never tried to make me leave so openly. My friend was kind enough to let me live with him until I'd be able to find an apartment, or at least until college started. I'm supposed to start college in the fall, and thankfully I didn't have to worry about the tuition because my maternal grandparents had a college fund for me which my parents couldn't touch. My dad's parents passed away when he was a teenager. I was very angry and upset about what my parents had said, so I blocked them as soon as I left, and I had no intention of unblocking them either. Like I said, we weren't really close, but I expected them to at least have the common decency to let me live in their house until I was able to afford my own place. I knew that they weren't obliged to look out for me now that I was an adult, but it still hurt. On the fourth day, I received a call from my grandparents, and they asked me to visit. I realized that they had no idea what had happened, so I visited them and told them everything. They'd always known that my parents weren't the most emotionally available people when it came to me, but they were livid when I told them about my parents insisting that I either pay rent or leave. They told me that it was outrageous and they couldn't accept behavior of this sort. They asked me to move in with them like they had several times before, but I refused yet again. My grandparents were old, and I didn't want to be an extra burden on them. My grandpa had a furniture company, and they were pretty comfortable financially, so it wasn't that which I was worried about. But my grandpa was suffering from Parkinson's, and my grandma had enough to deal with as it is. I didn't want to pile on and add more to her plate. I knew that they would have loved to have me there with them, but I cared too much about my grandparents to impose my presence on them. Besides, now that I was an adult, I couldn't just rely on them for help, and I had to make something of myself for the future. That's why I refused to move in with them, which disappointed them a little, but they understood where I was coming from. For me, it was just good enough that they'd even offered to let me live with them, because not a lot of people have that kind of heart, especially not the kind of people I grew up with. Not my parents, for sure. They told me that I could ask them for whatever help that I needed, and they'd be there for me, which meant a lot. I visited my grandparents at least once a week, but after that, I got kind of busy looking for apartments to move into because there was still a good few months to go before college started. Then yesterday, I received a call from my parents. My dad was using his business number because that was the only one that I'd forgotten to block. When I answered the call, I realized that both my parents were on the line to talk to me. They informed me that my grandparents had decided to back out of an investment on account of what I told them, and now my parents were panicking, because this was my father's business that he was going to start in a couple of months. My mother had convinced my grandpa with great difficulty to come on board as an investor, but as soon as he learned what my parents had said to me, he backed out of the deal. Apparently, my father's new business idea was also the reason he was asking me to pay rent, because then he would have another source of money as well and would end up saving a lot. So that money could eventually go into his business, and now they wanted my grandpa to come back on board, and I was the only person who could manage that. So they wanted to let me speak to him and bring him back. I told them that I wasn't going to do anything because this was their own fault. They'd been horrible to me not just recently, but for most of my life, and had made me feel like a burden literally constantly. So now they really had no right to expect anything of me. They dug their own grave, and now they had to lie in it. I was just about to disconnect the call when my mother told me how unfair and ungrateful I was being. She told me that all through my life it had been them who had paid for everything, and now that I had a little money of my own, I was turning my back on them. They told me that this was apparently my fault somehow because they really hadn't considered that I would end up leaving and moving out. She told me that the only reason they even expected and asked me to pay rent was because I could afford to, and they knew it, and apparently they weren't even going to ask me for much, but they didn't even get to the amount because I stormed off in such a rage. My mother almost started crying and told me that she knew they hadn't been the best parents, but that didn't mean that they didn't care for me, and the way I was acting right now made them feel as if they'd done something wrong. My dad told me that it was up to me what I wanted to do, but reminded me that this business that he was about to start was his dream project, and he would be shattered if it didn't come through only because they had asked me to do something as simple as pay rent, which was something a lot of parents all over the country do anyway without consequences. They told me to think about it and let them know within a week. And now I obviously feel like a horrible human being, and I have no idea what to do. ATA for moving out when my parents gave me an ultimatum to either move out or pay rent. Update 1. So, okay, I don't think I'm going to go back and apologize to my parents like I was planning to. My emotions just got the better of me that day, I guess. Now that I've thought about things with a clearer head and also read the comments on my post, I don't really think that I owe it to them to go back or apologize or speak to my grandparents and make everything right. I still have 2 days before I have to let them know about my decision, but I've already made up my mind, and I also know that they're not going to take this kindly. My mother was pretty emotional, but now that I think of it, the tears could have been fake just as easily. I couldn't see them, so who's to say if she was really crying or just pretending to cry? It sounds very cynical, but honestly, I don't trust my parents one bit, and it's not like they've done anything to remedy that situation. I haven't yet talked to my grandparents about this because I don't want to make it seem like I'm getting too involved in something that doesn't concern me. I have, however, to discuss this situation with my friends, and they think that whatever I'm doing is completely justified. My parents were the ones who started this fight, so now they can't just shift the blame onto me and expect me to be okay with it. They need to take accountability for their own actions. Update 2. Okay, so I have to tell my parents tomorrow about my decision, and today I decided to talk to my grandparents about this. I know I said that I was feeling good about my decision in the last update, but I feel like I have way too much of a conscience to just do this and not feel guilty about shattering my father's dreams. It's dramatic, I know, but that's exactly the way he put it. Now I don't know if that was for effect or if he really feels that way about his new business. When I talked to my grandparents about that phone call with my parents, they told me that I had nothing to worry about or feel guilty about. They said that after they learned from me about the ultimatum, they'd already made up their minds to back out of the deal. and now nothing was going to change that. It wasn't just me, but there were a couple of other factors as well that had led to them stepping down as investors in the business. They didn't even trust my father and had only come on board because of my mother. But now even that trust has been broken, and you just can't build a business without trust. That helped me with the guilt because either way, I couldn't have convinced my grandparents to come back on board with the deal. So this is technically really not my fault. It's their own. Update 3. Today I told my parents about my decision, and I don't know why I had even expected them to take it reasonably. I decided to break the news to them on the phone because I didn't want to risk more drama by turning up at their house. When I called them, my mother answered her phone and she sounded really excited, so I decided not to give them any false hope by beating around the bush and told her straight away that I decided not to talk to my grandparents and convinced them to come back on board. I told them my reasons as well and made sure that they knew the entire truth so they couldn't delude themselves into believing that they were somehow not at fault here. There were about 1,000 different ways that they could have gone about the situation without insulting me and making me feel small for not wanting to pay rent. Told them that the real reason I'd even started working at the age of 16 was because of them, because I didn't feel safe enough to rely on them and trust them. I knew that at some point they would want me out of their house, so I started working and saving up so I could move out at the earliest. They hadn't even bothered to think about college and set anything aside for me. I'm not saying that they were obliged to, but they were my parents and they could afford to do so. All my friends' parents were paying for their tuition, and I was the only one who was relying on my grandparents for it. They'd never ever made me feel like I could count on them, be it financially or even emotionally. And to be fair, they'd given me the choice to move out, so I just took them up on their own offer, and now they couldn't complain about it. I didn't owe it to them to talk to my grandparents and clear the air between them. Why should it be my problem if my dad doesn't get to live his dream of being a businessman when it wasn't his problem to think about where I would live if they demanded rent for me out of money that I was saving for my future? After I was done ranting, my dad told me that I was a huge disappointment and that he regretted even talking to me and hoping that I'd be reasonable about this whole thing. He told me that he felt like a failure because he'd raised an egoistic and self-centered jerk as a son, and there was nothing in the world that could bring him more shame than my behavior. I guess I shouldn't have, but I decided to take it up a notch and told my father that he didn't need to feel ashamed because he hadn't raised me to be this way. To be honest, he hadn't raised me at all, so he had nothing to worry about. That set him off, so I just put him on speaker and went on with breakfast while he screamed at me and my mother tried to calm him down. It was kind of entertaining for a while until he started accusing me of using them for money all these years. I don't understand what the heck that was about because I was literally just a child and they were my parents, so they were actually legally required to take care of me. So it wasn't as if they were doing me any favors by letting me stay in their house and giving me food to eat. They neglected me emotionally, and they would have done so financially as well had it not been the law that was stopping them from ignoring my existence altogether and leaving me to fend for myself. I told my father that I couldn't have been using him for money because up until a couple of days ago, I was legally still a minor, so he had to pay for my well-being within his means. And even then, I would try my very best not to ask him for money and use my savings for things that I would need, even if it was something as simple as sneakers. For the past few years, ever since I started working at the store, I've been paying for myself and trying to make myself as scarce as possible so as not to bother my parents, but even that didn't seem to be enough for them, and they constantly wanted more and more. So that turned into a pretty brutal argument, and he called me a lot of things, and so did my mother. And by the time I disconnected the call, I was pretty emotionally broken. I didn't know how to cope with it on my own, and I didn't want to disturb my friend because he worked late into the night and slept till late as well. He was already doing me a huge favor by letting me live with him without paying rent. I wasn't about to bother him with this burden as well, so I decided to call the only people who I knew I could rely on without a second thought. My grandparents answered the call almost immediately. I pretty much broke down into tears while telling them about my conversation with my parents that I had just before that. They seemed to be upset by the things that my parents had said to me as well, and said that they would fix the situation. I didn't understand what that meant, and I didn't want to ask either because I was sure that whatever my grandparents did will be for the best. Of course, my grandparents knew better than to try and reconcile me with my parents, so it was definitely not going to be that. They still haven't told me exactly what they're going to do, but I'm sure that it's not going to be something pleasant because of their tone. I could tell that they were not at all pleased with my parents and they were going to come down on them hard. I'm actually kind of excited about what's going to happen now. Update 4. Okay, so 2 days ago I told my grandparents about the very horrible phone call with my parents, and they told me that they would fix the situation. If you guys remember well, they finally fixed it today, and I've got to say I wasn't expecting this. They made a post on social media talking about how my parents had taken money from them for years on end just to be able to put food on the table while I was a child, and yet they seemed to have no gratitude for that and even had the audacity to mistreat me and treat me like a burden when their own parents had never done the same. Apparently, even the house that they lived in belonged to a friend of my grandparents who'd allowed them to live there at a lower rent thanks to my grandpa, so they really had no right to accuse me of using them for money when they'd done the very same thing to my grandparents when they just had me. At least I was still a kid. They were well into adulthood and even had a child, but was still incapable of scraping by on their own. Not only that, but I also found out that my parents would use me as an excuse to borrow excessive amounts of money from my grandparents when I was a baby. My grandparents knew that they were being scammed out of money, but they still went on giving and giving because they actually cared about their daughter. And today they were heartbroken to learn that my mother was not even capable of doing the same for her own son and thought that her husband was somehow more important than her son. They announced what a no-good idiot my father was back when I was a child, which is why they didn't want to invest in his business in the first place. He already tried to start 2 businesses when I was younger, but they didn't work, and my grandparents had to bail him out of those situations and pay off his debts. They didn't want to end up having to do that yet again, which is another reason that they backed out of the deal. So I guess now it finally makes sense why my grandparents were so hesitant to invest in my parents' business, and it's completely fair as well. Their post has received a lot of attention from my relatives and their friends, and I think I'm going to share it so that more people can see it and know how awful my parents are. So far, I haven't received any word from my parents. I'm guessing that they've seen the post, but just hadn't been able to come up with an adequate response to it because all of it is true. After all, I bet they regret being so heartless with me on the phone the other day. Had they just let me go peacefully, then they wouldn't have so much to deal with. Update 5. Well, it's been a week since my grandparents posted, and pretty much the entire family has cut my parents off. My grandparents told me that they got into a huge fight with my parents that evening after my mother showed up with my father at their house. They came there to confront my grandparents and make them take that post down somehow, but my grandparents weren't there in the slightest and stood their ground, because they knew that they were the reason my parents even had the audacity to come and confront them like this. Obviously, they were pretty nasty towards my grandparents as well and cursed them out pretty badly. But my grandparents didn't take it too hard because they knew that this was exactly what they could expect from people like them. They've been relentlessly trying to get that post down and have even sent my grandpa a defamation lawsuit because they're losing business due to that post, which has gained a lot of attention by now. I will literally never understand how my parents managed to take everything and then blame it on somebody else instead of just taking accountability for once in their lives. I think that they're physically incapable of acknowledging that they messed up and apologizing for it. They haven't contacted me yet, which I think is a good sign because it means that they're finally done bothering me. I've also spoken to my friend because recently I found an apartment that I could share with 2 roommates and the rent was minimal, so I could afford it. I talked to him about moving out, but to my surprise, he told me that I could live with him for as long as I needed to. Apparently, he'd read the post that I shared and he strongly believed that I should be saving money for the future because my parents were never going to come around and start helping me. They would always do their best to drag me down. He was a few years older than me and had been working for almost a year already. His parents gave him allowances now and then so he could easily afford to let me stay with him for a while. I feel really lucky to have a friend like him because it's rare to find such generous people in today's competitive world. I guess I hit the jackpot when it comes to having amazing